a translation that became widespread in the 80s. People liked it because it was modern English, and also because it had a lot of footnotes that were taken from straight out of Sahih al-Bukhari. Anything that Bukhari mentioned as an interpretation of a verse, they put it there in the footnotes. So that was a positive thing. This is the translation of Muhammad Hilali, who's a Moroccan, and Muhsin Khan, who's I believe an Afghan, or he's a Pashtun at any way. He's either Pakistani origin or Afghani origin, and he, if he's still alive, he's living in Medina. He lived there basically his whole life. So the translation originally came out in 1974, published in Turkey, and then it's been reprinted many times. The original version was almost unreadable because every time there would be a term such as taqwa or iqamat as-salah, recurring terms, every time that they appeared in the text, in the translation, there would be parentheses and the same lengthy explanation there in the text. So you're reading, and then you come to this roadblock that just completely derails your ability to concentrate on what was going on in the original. And then also, Yusuf Ali and Pickthall, I mean, everything is an interpretation, but they kept their commentaries pretty much out of, separated from translation. So your access to the original is much more direct in Pickthall and Abdullah Yusuf Ali. With Muhsin Khan, Hilali translation, their interpretation is so mixed in with the text that it's, if you don't have access to the Arabic directly, you couldn't begin to guess where the one stops and the other starts. So some of those problems of the repetition, the problem, of this chunk of stuff in the text that prevents you from actually being able to understand what the basic gist of the sentence is. Some of that has been, I think, dealt with in some of the later editions of it. But I still don't like that translation. Anyway, Muhammad Asad in 1980, he published what he called the Message of the Qur'an, the translation with footnotes. Now, he was originally an Austrian Jew who worked as a freelance correspondent in the Middle East, starting right after World War I believe. And he ended up accepting Islam in the late 20s. Had a fascinating life. He wrote some fascinating books, The Road to Mecca, Islam at the Crossroads. That represented an early point in his intellectual progression. At one time, he was Pakistan's ambassador to the UN. Very interesting man. He ended up sort of living in isolation in Gibraltar, which is an interesting choice because he was at the edge of the Islamic world, but between the two, between Europe and Morocco. And so the thing about him is that he's an ultra-rationalist, a neo-Mu'tazilite. Of course, he brushes away miraculous things in general, but he goes further than that, and he says that a story like Suleiman, and the ants understand. He understood the language of the ants, and this talking to the hudhud, and all those kind of aspects of the story of Suleiman. That this is basically it's a made-up story that was, the intent was a teaching story. So it was created in order to address the target audience of that time in symbols that would be accessible to them. So that's a pretty heavy ta'wil and tahrif. It comes smack up against what the Qur'an says, that these are not invented stories. They are historical narratives. Considerable amount of caution needs to be used with his when approaching his work. Although, I have to say that some of his phrasings and his word choices are just exquisite and really, really nicely done. And it's just amazing that this is done by a non-native English speaker. His facility in English was so fine, and his command of the English language was so masterful. Although he was working in what was not his native language, he did better than many a native speaker could do. Some of the examples of his strange rationalisms in Surat Qaf, Muhammad Pickthall's version of this verse 17, when the two receivers receive him seated on the right hand and on the left. This is widely, I guess you could say universally understood to refer to angels, recording angels. Asad, he rendered the two receivers as, quote, the two demands of his nature, unquote. And Hamim, in I believe it's Surah Al-Waqi'ah, verse 93, it's rendered as burning despair rather than scalding water, which is the literal meaning. One of the recent translations I think stands out from the rest, because translations of Qur'an in English, they seem to be coming out a couple a year. And one person who seems to have unusually good qualifications for it is his name is listed as M.A.S. Abdul Halim. I'm guessing that he's Egyptian. He translated Muhammad Draz's introduction to the Qur'an into English, and he's written numerous articles on the Qur'an and the nature of its language. And so I'm guessing, again, his book was published in England. I'm guessing that he's like a professor of Islamic studies or tafseer or something like that in some English institution. His translation is called the Qur'an. There's no mention of some the meanings of the Qur'an or something like that. It's the Qur'an. So one could take him to task for that. And then he says, a revised or a new translation, something like that. It's published in 2004. It has a lot of positive features. The language is modern English. He organizes the ayat in paragraphs so that you're able to appreciate the building of a thought, a line of thought. Frequently each verse is printed separately, so you get this very disjointed sense. You don't get the sense of a flow from reading it. So he organizes it into paragraphs. But unlike others who did that, he identifies every single verse by number. He puts a little, looks like almost like a footnote, a superscript number at the start of each verse. So for purposes of reference, you're able to know exactly what the verses are, but it's unobtrusive, so it doesn't interrupt your ability to concentrate on the flow. And he also makes a point that there are terms that recur in the Qur'an and they don't always mean the same thing. So he paid attention to the contextual meaning of those recurring terms in any particular context, what it means in that context. He has a whole concern about the use of pronouns. we know that sometimes the Prophet ﷺ is being addressed, and the you will be anta, or you'll understand from the verb form that it's a single you that's being addressed, and then it'll shift to a plural you, and English doesn't accommodate that. So an example of the way he deals with it in Surah Yunus, verse 61, a translation, in whatever matter you, and then in brackets he says prophet, may be engaged, and whatever part of the Qur'an you are reciting, whatever work you, and then in brackets people, are doing, we witnessed you when you are engaged in. He tries to play down iltifat, where the pronoun shifts during a sentence. Sometimes that's done by putting a dash, an em dash, to set off a portion of the sentence from the rest of it. And sometimes he does it by simply just putting in a period and breaking the sentence into smaller units. And another thing that he calls attention to is the original meanings. He takes care to translate things according to their original meanings rather than what they've come to mean, what the word may have come to mean in standard modern Arabic. So a term like walad originally meant child. Nowadays it means son or boy. For instance, what Pixel translates verse 116 of Surah Al-Baqarah, and they say Allah has taken unto himself a son. He may have chosen that based on the fact that was the meaning of walad when he was learning Arabic, or maybe because of his Christian background. However, the Arabs identified angels as being daughters of Allah. And so in Abdul Halim's translation, he says, they have asserted God has a child. And then he also talks about tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, gardens, description of the gardens of paradise that literally beneath which rivers flow. So you get the sense of underground rivers. He translates it quite differently as graced with flowing streams. And in what I've transferred into this document that you'll be reading, you can read his explanation for why. He has very minimal footnotes, and he mentions that he relied primarily on Fakhr al-Razi and Abu Hayyan, who's the Andalusian scholar whose focus was on the language of the Quran, and also al-Baydawi. So those are the people he relied upon for his footnotes. If we look at tafsirs in English, of course we have the Ibn Kathir, put out by Dar es-Salaam, and they make it much more readable. I mean, it's a really fine work. It's a very accessible, makes tafsir very accessible in English. Now they've cut out a lot of the repetition. I think there are a certain amount of questions to whether that was the only criterion for them removing material. I mean, authenticity was also an issue for them. They may have removed certain things also for ideological reasons. That's an issue open to a certain amount of argument. Anyway, it's a recommended tafsir. Long before that, you had a scholar from India, Abdul Majid Daryabadi, who he'd done a translation and I think commentary of Qur'an into Urdu, and then I believe it was in the 1940s that he turned to producing an English commentary. Again, the language is pretty archaic. The Arabic verses are placed in a block at the top of the page, and then each English verse has sort of the first Arabic words of the verse in parentheses so that you can identify it that that's the verse, and they're set one by one, and then he'll have footnotes and his comments below that. One gets a sense of very much of Abdullah Yusuf Ali's kind of sensibility. He mentioned that he relied also heavily upon Wary's notes, upon George Sale's translation. He frequently quotes English or English-speaking writers, to try to make these Quranic concepts acceptable to an English reader of his era. So you get the sense very much of an apologetic type of commentary. Quotes the Bible a lot. And then there's one other that I would mention. I forgot to note the name of the author. It's Tafsir Ishraq al-Ma'ani, put out by an Indian scholar, I believe in the late 80s, early 90s. It seems to be, I went through a portion of this Tafsir of Surah Tawbah, a fairly, conservative. It relies very heavily on maybe about 30 different classical tafsirs, and also some reputable modern tafsirs like Adwa al-Bayan. He also relies on Tafsir al-Manar of Hamid Rashid Ridha. So, in looking at what he had about Surah Tawbah, I didn't see anything objectionable. It's following that methodology. He starts with Tafsir bil-ma'thoor, and then he brings in fiqh issues, and it's a fairly well organized and systematic tafsir, and Allah knows best. So that's the end of this lecture, the end of the course, and we'll, in the live session, inshallah, we'll talk about some of the wrap-up issues. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.